The morning Eliza Merritt decided to fight back. The sky above Caldwell, Kansas was the color of a bruised purple and yellow at its edges, tender and raw at its center, and she had not slept a single hour of the night before. She stood at the small window of the room she rented above the dry goods store, her dark hair unbound and falling across her shoulders, and she watched the street below as the town held its breath before dawn. The year was 1882, and Caldwell sat along the Kishom Trail like a bead on a string, catching the dust and blood and money that moved between Texas and the railheads to the north. It was not a gentle town. It had never pretended to be. There were saloons that never fully closed, cattle pens that smelled of manure and fear, and a courthouse at the end of Main Street that was supposed to represent justice, but had, in Eliza's experience, mostly represented the interests of men with money and lawyers and land. Her husband, Thomas Merritt, had been dead for 4 months. She still reached for him in the mornings, still turned to say something ordinary and found the space beside her empty and cold. Thomas had been a good man, not a perfect man, not a wealthy man, but honest and warm in hers, and he had been shot on his own property by men who worked for Gerald Crane, the largest cattle baron in Sumner County, during a dispute over a water easement that Crane had decided he wanted, and that Thomas had decided he would not give. The sheriff had ruled it a matter of self-defense. The circuit judge had agreed. And now Gerald Crane was moving to claim the Merritt homestead on the grounds of an alleged unpaid debt, a debt that Eliza was certain had been manufactured on paper by men in Crane's employ. She had spent 4 months grieving and 2 months being afraid, and the last 2 weeks deciding she was done with both. The deed to the property was in her name. Thomas had seen to that, quietly and deliberately, the previous spring, as if some part of him had known what was coming. She had the document. She had her testimony. What she did not have was a lawyer willing to take her case against Gerald Crane, because every lawyer in Caldwell either owed Crane money or feared him enough to behave as if they did. So she would go to the courthouse herself, at opening hour, and she would file the deed as contested property before Crane's men could beat her to it. The circuit judge was arriving on the morning train, and she had written to him directly 3 letters, in her careful schoolteacher's hand, explaining the situation with dates and names and figures that she had verified herself. One of those letters had been acknowledged. That was enough. She dressed in the gray wool dress that she had worn to Thomas's funeral, because it was the most serious thing she owned, and she pinned her hair back and she pulled on her good boots, and she did not look at the daguerreotype of her wedding day that sat on the small table by the window. She could not afford to be soft this morning. She could afford only to be determined. The street was empty when she stepped outside. Even the saloons had gone quiet. The air was cold in the particular way that Kansas mornings were cold in late October, sharp and clean, and just slightly threatening, like a blade kept in a drawer. Her breath made small clouds ahead of her as she walked, and her boot heels struck the wooden boardwalk with a sound like a clock counting down. She was halfway to the courthouse when she saw him. He was leaning against the wall beside the courthouse door with his arms crossed and his hat tipped forward, and he might have been sleeping except that she could tell by the angle of his shoulders that he was not. She knew who he was. Every person in Caldwell knew who Ralph Yates was, in the same way they knew where the rattlesnakes liked to sun themselves. It was useful information, the kind that kept you cautious and alive. He was 30 years old, dark-eyed, with a jaw that looked as though it had been cut from sandstone, and he had a reputation that ran ahead of him like smoke before a fire. He had ridden with a gang out of Indian Territory 3 years ago. He had been in at least 2 gunfights that people talked about, and probably several more that they did not. He had spent 8 months in a jail in Dodge City, and had ridden out when his sentence was served without appearing particularly grateful for his freedom or particularly reformed by his confinement. He was also, if the whispers in Caldwell were to be believed, the reason that Gerald Crane's foreman had ridden out of town last spring with a broken jaw and never come back. Nobody had officially connected Ralph Yates to that incident. Nobody had tried very hard to. Eliza had her own reasons for despising him, reasons that went beyond whisper and reputation. Ralph Yates had ridden with the men who had come to her homestead the day Thomas died. She had not seen him pull a trigger. She had been inside the house, behind the door, listening to voices raised in argument. But she had seen him ride away afterward, unhurried, his horse moving at a leisurely pace down the lane while Thomas lay bleeding in the yard. She had not known his name then. She had learned it a week later, from the deputy who came to ask her if she had seen anything, and she had given him Ralph Yates' description without hesitation, and the deputy had written it down and told her he would look into it, and she had never heard another word. She had not expected anything different, but she had not forgotten. And now here he was at the courthouse door at dawn, and she had no idea what to do with that except keep walking, because she had come too far and had too much at stake to turn around because a man she despised was standing in her path. She climbed the courthouse steps. He straightened when he heard her coming, tipped his hat back with one finger and looked at her with those dark eyes that gave nothing away. Then, without a word, he reached out and pulled open the courthouse door. She stopped 2 steps below him. "I did not ask for your help," she said. "No," he agreed, "you did not." "Then close it." He considered her for a moment. In the gray light of early dawn, he looked like something that had been left out in the weather for a long time, worn and hard and not quite comfortable to look at directly, but real in a way that a lot of men in that town were not. There was something in his expression that she could not immediately name. It was not contempt. It was not amusement. It was something more complicated than either of those things. "Mrs. Merritt," he said, and her name in his mouth was so unexpected that it stopped her cold, because it meant he knew who she was, had known before this morning, had perhaps come here because of who she was. "Gerald Crane has 2 men inside that building right now, waiting for the clerk to arrive so they can file documents claiming your land. The clerk arrives in 20 minutes. I suggest you stop arguing with me about the door and go inside." She stared at him. Everything in her chest wanted to refuse him, wanted to demand an explanation for why he had ridden away while her husband lay dying, wanted to say all of the hard and burning things she had been carrying for 4 months. But she was not a foolish woman. She understood the arithmetic of the situation. 20 minutes, 2 of Crane's men. Her deed folded in her coat pocket. She walked through the door he was holding. The interior of the Caldwell courthouse was dim and smelled of wood polish and old paper. A single lamp burned on a desk near the window, casting a yellow circle of light across a surface covered in stacked documents. 2 men sat in chairs along the far wall. She recognized one of them as Hector Blaine, who did errands of the unpleasant variety for Gerald Crane, a broad-shouldered man with small eyes and a habit of cleaning his fingernails with a penknife. The other she did not know by name. Blaine looked up when she entered, and his expression shifted through surprise and then calculation. "Mrs. Merritt," he said, in the same tone a man uses when he finds a spider in his boot. "Courthouse doesn't open for another 20 minutes. "Then we're all here early," she said. She crossed to the clerk's window and stood at it as if she intended to take root there, the deed folded in her hands. She heard Ralph Yates come in behind her, heard the door close, and she felt rather than saw him take up a position off to her right, not beside her exactly, but near enough that it meant something. "You've got no business being here with her," Blaine said. His eyes were on Ralph now, the penknife still in his hand. "I'm not with her," Ralph said easily. "I'm just here. Same difference. You're welcome to see it however you like." Eliza did not look at either of them. She kept her eyes on the clerk's window and she kept her hands steady and she breathed carefully and evenly. The minutes passed like stones dropping into water. Outside she could hear the town beginning to wake, a horse moving, a distant shout, the sound of a train whistle far off to the northeast. The clerk arrived at 7 minutes past 6. He was a thin young man named Avery Foss who was terrified of everyone and therefore completely neutral in his terror, which was perhaps the only qualification for the job that mattered. He unlocked the inner door and stopped when he saw the room full of people. "I'll take everyone in the order they arrived," he said, in the voice of a man who had said those words before as a kind of prayer. "I was here first," Eliza said. "She was," Ralph said from across the room. Blaine stood up. "Now listen here, I will take everyone in the order they arrived," Foss repeated, louder this time, and there was something almost admirable in the way he stood his ground. He looked at Eliza. "Ma'am." "Your business." She laid the deed on the counter, and she presented her case in clear, measured sentences. And Avery Foss recorded everything with the careful neutrality of a man who wanted to go home to his supper undisturbed. And when it was done, her claim was filed and dated and stamped before Crane's men could put a single word into the official record. When she walked back out into the morning, the sun had cleared the horizon and the street was fully awake, and she was shaking in a way she could not stop, the kind of shaking that comes after a thing is done and the body finally releases what it was holding. She sat down on the courthouse steps without meaning to, because her legs simply decided the ground was close enough. She heard boots on the steps and looked up, and Ralph Yates sat down beside her, not too close, his elbows on his knees, looking out at the street as if they were two people watching a parade. "You can go," she said. "I can," he agreed. He did not go. She wanted to be angry about that. She found she was not quite angry. She was too shaken for anger, too wrung out from the effort of this morning to manage anything as forceful as anger. What she felt instead was something rawer and more confusing, a helpless sort of need to understand why he was here and what it meant, and why he had looked at her with that expression on the steps that she had still not managed to name. "Why did you come?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than before, stripped of the easy flatness it had in the courthouse. "Because I knew Crane was going to try it," he said, "and I knew you were going to come. And I knew you were going to need someone who wasn't afraid of Hector Blaine to back your play. How did you know I would come this morning?" He turned to look at her, and in the full morning light she could see his face properly for the first time. The lines at the corners of his eyes, the old scar along his jaw, the dark color of his gaze that she had initially read as cold and now was not sure was cold at all. "Because you're the kind of woman who doesn't wait," he said. "Thomas knew that about you. He talked about you." She felt something inside her go very still. "You knew Thomas," she said, and it was not quite a question. "Before Crane," Ralph said quietly. "A long time before any of this. We knew each other when we were young men, before I made the choices I made. He was a better man than I was. He always was." Looked at him for a long time. The morning moved around them, indifferent and golden, and Caldwell went about its business, and she tried to reconcile the man beside her with the figure she had built in her mind over 4 months of grief and anger. "You were there," she said. "The day he died, I saw you ride away." His jaw tightened. "I was there," he said. "I came to try to stop it. I was too late. By the time I arrived, it was already done. You could have stayed." "I know it." He looked at his hands. "I told myself the sheriff wouldn't believe me. That staying would only complicate things for you. Those were the reasons I gave myself." He paused. "I've had 4 months to reckon with whether they were the real reasons or just the easier ones." She did not know what to say to that, and so she said nothing, and the honesty of what he had offered sat between them in the quiet morning air. She stood up eventually, brushing the dust from her gray wool skirt, and he stood up too, and they looked at each other on the courthouse steps in the early October sun. "I cannot tell you that we are even," she said. "I cannot tell you that what you just did today settles what was not done on the day he died." "I know that," he said. "But I am not ungrateful," she said. "And I am not entirely certain of everything I thought I knew about you." He picked up his hat from the step where he had set it, and he turned it in his hands once before settling it on his head. "That's more than I deserve," he said simply. She walked home through the brightening morning, and she did not look back, but she was aware of him standing on the courthouse steps watching her go, and for the first time in 4 months something in her chest that had been locked tight and small and cold felt the faintest, most tentative loosening. The weeks that followed were busy in the particular way that grief mixed with legal battle makes a person busy, which is to say exhausted and purposeful, and running on a kind of grim forward momentum. The circuit judge, whose name was Harmon Briggs, arrived on the morning train as expected, and proved to be a square-shouldered man in his 50s, who had the look of someone who had heard every lie available in the Western Territories, and was not particularly interested in hearing any of them again. He reviewed Eliza's filings with care. He reviewed Crane's counter-filings with equal care and considerably less patience, because Crane's documents were full of the kind of language that suggested a lawyer who was charging too much and working too little. Eliza testified before Judge Briggs in the same courthouse, 4 days after the morning she had climbed its steps alone, and she told the truth in the clear, methodical way she had always been able to speak when she was not afraid, and she watched the judge's face and knew that he was listening. She presented the deed in Thomas's handwriting and her own. She presented the letters she had written. She presented a letter from the land office in Wichita that confirmed the original filing. Gerald Crane's lawyer, a round-faced man from Wichita named Pemberton, objected twice and was overruled twice and said nothing further. Judge Briggs ruled in Eliza's favor on a Tuesday afternoon. She walked out of that courthouse in the same gray wool dress, and she stood in the October sun, and she pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed, and this time she did not sit down on the steps because she was afraid her legs would not hold her. This time she stood. "That's good news, I take it." She turned. Ralph Yates was leaning against the fence post across the street, which she was beginning to think might be his particular habit, appearing in places where she was, a little apart from things, watching. He was holding the reins of a bay horse that was nibbling at the corner of a feed sack left propped against the post, and he had the look of a man who had been waiting for a while. "The judge ruled in my favor," she said. He nodded. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, not quite relief, but a combination of the two that was more expressive than anything she had seen from him before. "I'm glad," he said. She walked across the street. She was not sure why she did it except that she wanted to, which was itself a new and slightly startling thing to discover about herself. "Were you waiting to hear?" she asked. "I was in the neighborhood," he said. "You were leaning against that post watching the courthouse door. Could be I like this fence post." She looked at him steadily, and the corner of his mouth moved barely, just enough to be visible, and she thought that despite everything, despite the reputation and the history and the 4 months of anger she had carried like a stone in her pocket, there was something in Ralph Yates that was unexpectedly and inconveniently honest. He did not pretend to be something he was not. He did not offer her easy comfort or smooth words. What he offered was the plain truth of what he was, the way a person holds out something ordinary in their hands and simply shows it to you. She had not had anyone to talk to in a very long time. "Would you like to have supper?" she asked, surprising herself. At the boarding house, the dining room, public, perfectly proper. She felt heat in her face and faced it down. "I find that I would like to tell someone how it went in there, and you are the only person on this street who appears to care." He looked at her for a moment as if he were checking to see if she was serious. Then he straightened, looped his horse's reins over the post, and said simply, "Yes, Mrs. Merritt, I would like that." They ate at the long table in Mrs. Calvert's boarding house dining room, which was as public and proper as anything in Caldwell could be, and Eliza told him everything. The judge's face during testimony, the moment she had realized Pemberton was going to lose, the sound of the gavel coming down. She talked more than she had talked in weeks, maybe months, and Ralph listened the way people rarely listened, without preparing what he would say next, without filling the pauses with useless noise, without making the story about himself. When she had finished, he told her about the water dispute, about how he had heard from a man he trusted that Crane's foreman was planning to move against Thomas, and how he had ridden out that morning, meaning to intervene, and arrived to find that the thing was already done and Thomas was already beyond help. He told it plainly, without excuses, the way a person confesses a thing they are not proud of, and she heard the weight behind it. She did not absolve him. She was not sure it was her place to do that, but she listened, and she believed him, and those were things she had not expected to do. When they walked out of the boarding house afterward, the evening was cool and sharp, and the lanterns along the street had been lit, and Caldwell had shifted from its daytime self into its nighttime one, louder and rougher and lit from within by the warm yellow light of saloons. "Thank you," she said at the corner where they would part ways. "For supper," he said. "For the courthouse," she said. "And for supper, and for telling me the truth." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with a gravity that she had not expected, he said, "I owe you more than I can repay, Mrs. Merritt. I intend to keep trying anyway." She watched him walk away, and she thought about the word intend, which sounded like a promise rather than a pleasantry, and she went upstairs to her rented room and sat by the window and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the world might contain something worth turning toward. She moved back to the homestead the following week. The house was small, set on 40 acres of grassland with a creek running through the northeast corner, and it was in the condition that 4 months of absence and autumn weather could produce. The window in the back bedroom had let the rain in, the front porch step had rotted through, and the kitchen garden had gone completely to seed. But it was hers. The deed said so, and a circuit judge had confirmed it, and Gerald Crane's men had not come back since the ruling, perhaps because Crane himself had enough trouble without adding contempt of court to his list. She had grown up in Ohio and come west with Thomas at 22 in 1876, and she had learned how to work land because there was no other choice, and had discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was good at it. She was 28 now. She was not afraid of the work. But she was very much alone. She was patching the back bedroom window on her second day home, balanced on a crate with a piece of oilcloth and a hammer, when she heard a horse in the yard. She came around the corner of the house ready to be furious in case it was Crane's men, and found Ralph Yates sitting on that bay horse with a bundle of cedar shingles balanced across his saddle. "The porch step," he said. She put her hands on her hips. "The step is my business." "I can see that," he said. "I brought shingles in case the business required them." She looked at him and then at the shingles and then at him again. "You came all the way out here to fix a porch step you haven't even seen." "I came all the way out here to see if I could be useful," he said. "The shingles were available at the hardware store, and I knew from the look of the place the last time I was out this way that the porch needed attention." He paused. "I can go back to town if you prefer." She was silent for a moment, weighing things. He was right that the step needed fixing. She was also right that she could fix it herself, and she had been planning to. But she looked at him sitting there on his horse in the October afternoon, not quite asking for anything, just offering what he had. And she thought about what Thomas had said to her once, the year after they were married, when she had refused to ask a neighbor for help with the roof during a bad storm. He had said, "Eliza, letting people help you is not weakness. Sometimes it is the most courageous thing you can do." "Come down then," she said. "I will make coffee." They worked the afternoon away, side by side and separately as the tasks required, and Eliza learned several things about Ralph Yates that an evening at a public dining table had not revealed. He was methodical with his hands, patient with small tasks, good at noticing what needed doing without being told. He did not talk constantly, which she appreciated. When he did speak, it was usually something worth hearing. He told her he had been born in Missouri, that his father had been a farmer and his mother a schoolteacher, that he had gone wrong in the way young men went wrong when they had more wildness in them than wisdom and less patience for the slow life than for the fast one. He had ridden into the territories with men who were worse than he was and learned things he wished he had not learned and done things he was not proud of, and then he had gotten out, the way some men managed and more men did not. "What made you get out?" she asked. They were on the porch, the step was fixed, The coffee was gone cold in the cups. "A man I knew," he said. "He got shot in a dispute over horses that weren't worth the argument. 24 years old and face down in the mud. I looked at him lying there and I thought, that is where this road goes. And I decided I did not want to go there." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Your husband was part of it too by then. We were still in some contact. He told me the same thing a dozen different ways over the years until I finally listened." She looked at the last light fading over the grassland, the sky going amber and rose at the horizon. "Thomas had a gift for that," she said softly, "for saying things until the right person heard them." "He did," Ralph said. "He was a good man. The best I ever knew." They sat with that for a while, not uncomfortable, because grief shared between people who both carry a piece of the same loss has its own particular quiet. Before he left, he tied his bay horse to the post and turned at the gate and said, "I would like to come back, Mrs. Merritt, if you'll allow it." She considered him. The November wind was picking up across the grass, and the sky was going dark, and she was standing on her porch with her fixed step and her oilcloth window patch and 4 months of widowhood behind her, and she thought about what it would mean to allow Ralph Yates to come back. "You may come back," she said. "But understand that I am not looking for charity and I am not a project, and if you are coming because you feel you owe a debt to Thomas, then that is the wrong reason." "It stopped being about Thomas," he said quietly, "somewhere around the time you told me about the judge's face during testimony." She felt the warmth of that land in her chest like a match struck in a cold room, small and real and startling. "Saturday," she said. "There is a fence section down along the north pasture." He put his hat on. "I'll bring wire," he said. He came on Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and the one after that, and gradually, not all at once, not with any declaration or ceremony, but the way a fire builds from a small coal, something grew between them that was warmer and more complicated and more alive than anything Eliza had expected to feel again in this particular life. She was careful with it. She had loved Thomas deeply and truly, and the loss of him was not something that faded away or was replaced. It was something that she carried, that became a part of her, that she made room for alongside the new things she was beginning to feel. She was not replacing what she had lost. She was discovering that the human heart had more room in it than she had previously believed. Ralph was careful too. He never pushed. He never assumed. He brought wire and tools and an extra hand during the last of the fall butchering, and then again during the early winter when a cold snap came hard and she needed help with the livestock. He sat on her porch and talked with her in the evenings and told her stories about the territories, and listened to her talk about Ohio and her schoolteacher mother, and the books she had read, and the things she thought about the world. He made her laugh twice in November, which surprised her both times. He showed up when he said he would and stayed no longer than was proper, and asked nothing from her that she had not offered. And she found herself offering more, little by little, the way a person opens a window in a room that has been closed too long. December came in hard and cold, and Eliza received a letter from her sister in Cincinnati asking if she intended to stay in Kansas or come home, and she sat at the table with that letter for a long time before she wrote back to say that she intended to stay. She told Ralph about the letter on a Sunday afternoon, when he had ridden out to help her pull a calf that had come too early and too cold, and needed more hands than she had available. They had saved the calf, which was now shivering and warm in the corner of the barn in a pile of straw, and they were sitting on the barn floor in the hay, both of them tired and muddy and satisfied with the small victory, and the wind was doing considerable things outside, but inside the barn it was warm with animal heat and the lantern light. "She wants me to come back east," Eliza said. "Do you want to go?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. "No," she said. "This land is mine now, not just in law, in something that goes deeper than law. Thomas and I worked it together, and I know every foot of it. I am not leaving it." He nodded slowly. "And," she said, and then stopped, because the rest of that sentence was more than she was ready to say. He looked at her. In the lantern light, his dark eyes were warm rather than cold, and his face had that quality she had come to recognize, the openness that he wore only when he was not thinking about his reputation, only when he was being exactly who he was without the armor of it. "And," he prompted gently. She looked at the small calf breathing steadily in its straw corner because it was easier to look at than him. "And there is something here worth staying for," she said, "besides the land." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was careful and very sincere, "Eliza." It was the first time he had used her first name, and it moved through her like a warm current. "I have been trying to be patient," he said, "and I have been trying to be decent about this, because you deserve patience and decency, and I know that what I have to offer is less obvious and less simple than what Thomas gave you. I am not a simple man, and I have a past that does not recommend itself, and I would not fault you if you took your sister's offer and went east and put all of this, including me, behind you." He paused. She did not fill the pause. "But I want you to know," he said, "that there is no woman I have met in my life who has impressed me as much as you have, and that coming out here these weeks has been the best part of my life in longer than I can remember, and I believe that what I feel for you is something I have not felt before, and I am not going to pretend otherwise just because the timing is complicated." She turned and looked at him fully. He was looking back at her, steady and unhurried, not demanding anything, just telling the truth and letting it lie there between them in the hay and the lantern light and the warm sound of the animals shifting in their stalls. "Ralph," she said, "I am still learning who you are." "I know it," he said. "I am not done grieving Thomas. I know that too. But I have not wanted to stay in the same room with anyone the way I want to stay in a room with you," she said, "in longer than I can remember, and I think that means something." He reached out slowly and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his back, and they sat like that in the December barn with the newborn calf and the wind outside and the lantern burning down, and it was the simplest and most powerful thing Eliza had felt in a very long time. Gerald Crane was not finished, of course. Men like Gerald Crane were never finished. They simply changed their methods. In January, he sent 2 of his men to divert the creek that ran through the northeast corner of Eliza's land, not by force this time, but by engineering, by building a small dam on land adjacent to hers that was technically his to dam, but that in doing so cut off the water she needed for the livestock and for the house. It was the kind of move that could be presented as innocent and was not innocent at all. Ralph came out to the land the morning she discovered it and walked the creek bed with her in the January cold, both of them pulling their coats tight against the wind. "He's clever," Ralph said. "He's vindictive," Eliza said, "which is different. Clever people find solutions. Vindictive people just find new problems to cause." "You need a water lawyer," Ralph said, "the kind who knows riparian rights." "I know what riparian rights are," Eliza said. "What I don't know is where to find a lawyer willing to push Crane on them." Ralph was quiet for a moment, looking at the dry creek bed. Then he said, "Dodge City." She looked at him. "There's a lawyer there, name of Patrick Hale, who doesn't have Crane's money in his pocket. He's handled water cases in Ford County. He might come down." He paused. "I know him from a previous circumstance that I will not specify, but I believe he would hear us out." She noted the word "us." She did not comment on it, but she noted it. "Write to him," she said. He did, and Patrick Hale came down from Dodge City in February, a compact, sharp-eyed Irishman who looked at the dam and the creek bed and the property lines, and pronounced the whole arrangement a violation of prior appropriation doctrine, which was Kansas water law, and filed an injunction against Crane in the federal court in Wichita on a Monday morning. The injunction came down 3 weeks later. The dam came down a week after that. The water came back to Eliza's land in a rush, cold and clear and unannounced, on a Thursday morning when Ralph was there mending fence along the north pasture, and she was in the kitchen garden beginning the first of the spring preparations. She heard it before she saw it, the sound of water moving in a dry bed, a low and rushing murmur that grew, and she ran to the bank of the creek and stood watching the water come back, and she was not entirely sure when she started crying, only that she was, and that it was not entirely about the water. Ralph came up behind her and stood next to her on the bank. He did not say anything. He simply stood there beside her, close enough that their shoulders were touching, and he let her cry without trying to stop it or explain it or fix it, because he had understood by this point that some things needed to be felt all the way through. After a while she wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, "I am sorry." "Don't be," he said. "It is only water." "It is not only water," he said. "It is everything you fought for, and it was in doubt, and now it is not. You are allowed to feel that." She turned and looked at him, and the March sun was bright and the prairie wind was beginning to carry a hint of warmth for the first time since November, and his face was turned down toward her, patient and real and steady. She kissed him. She did it with her hands still wet from wiping her face, and the mud of the creek bank on her boots and the wind pulling at her hair, and it was not a polished or careful thing. It was simply and entirely honest, and for a moment he was still with surprise, and then he was not still at all. His hand came up to her face, and he kissed her back with a warmth and a careful tenderness that she had not expected from a man with that history and that face and that reputation. And the whole of it was so thoroughly real that she felt it in her bones. When they stepped back from each other, he was looking at her with something in his face that she had no trouble naming now. It was the exact expression she had seen on the courthouse steps on that early October morning, the one she had been unable to place, and now she understood it completely. He had already been in love with her that morning. He had been in love with her before she had known his name properly, in the way that people can love someone from a distance through the stories they hear, through the grief they share at a remove, through the watching of a person live with courage and clarity and grace. "I have wanted to do that," she said, "since approximately November." "I have wanted to do that," he said, "since approximately the courthouse steps." She laughed. It came up from somewhere deep and warm and surprised her with its fullness, and he smiled in response. A real smile, open and unguarded, and she thought she had never seen anything that changed a face so entirely as a true smile on a man who didn't wear them often. She took his hand and they walked back to the house, and the creek ran behind them, full and clear and restored. Spring came in gradually and then all at once, the way Kansas springs always did, and the land greened up and the garden grew, and the livestock came through winter better than Eliza had feared, and Ralph Yates spent more time at the Merritt homestead than he spent anywhere else, which was a fact that Caldwell noticed and discussed in the particular way that small towns notice and discuss everything. Opinion was divided, as it tended to be. Mrs. Calvert at the boarding house, who had liked Eliza from the beginning, said that a woman alone on 40 acres needed a reliable man, and that whatever his past, Ralph Yates seemed to be a reliable one. Old Garrett at the hardware store said that a man who had ridden with a gang out of Indian Territory was not someone he would want courting anyone he cared about. The deputy, whose name was Sands, and who had taken Eliza's statement about Thomas's death and done nothing useful with it, was of the opinion that it was not his business. Gerald Crane, from the direction of his large ranch on the eastern side of the county, said nothing that reached Eliza directly, but she heard that he had been heard to call Ralph Yates a word that was not polite, and to say that the widow would regret her associations. Eliza filed that away without particular concern. Crane had said worse and done worse, and had so far been stopped by courts and water lawyers and an outlaw at a courthouse door, and she was not inclined to lose sleep over his opinions. The conversation she had feared more was the one with Ralph himself, on a late April evening when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, and she asked him directly about the future. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want an honest answer." "That's the only kind I have," he said. "The past," she said, "the gang, The things you did in the territories, are any of them going to come back? Are there men who might come here looking for you, things unfinished that could put this land or anyone here in danger?" He did not answer immediately, which she took as a good sign, because it meant he was thinking rather than reassuring. "There were warrants," he said finally. "Kansas and Indian Territory. I served time in Dodge on the Kansas warrant. The Territory warrant was dropped when a witness recanted, and the man who issued it is dead. There is no legal danger from my past that I know of." He paused. "There are men who rode with that gang who are less interested in the law than in personal grievances, but most of them are scattered and a few of them are dead, and none of them have any cause to come here unless someone sends them." Would Crane send them? He considered that. Crane likes legal tools. He is a man of property, and he understands that violence invites legal scrutiny. If he wanted to use men against me, he would have done it before now. He looked at her steadily. "I believe I can tell you in good conscience that the danger from my past is real but manageable. I cannot promise you absolute safety because nobody in this territory can, but I can tell you that I have done everything I know how to do to put what I was behind me." She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze without flinching. "I believe you," she said. "I want you to know that I do not say that lightly." "I know you don't," he said. "That is why it means something." She took a breath. "Then I want to say something else." He waited. "I love this land," she said, "and I intend to work it for the rest of my life. I want to plant a full kitchen garden and expand the south pasture and eventually run more cattle than I currently can. I want to fix the back bedroom properly and put a real porch on the east side where the evening light comes in." She paused. "I am not a woman who needs rescuing, and I am not a woman who can be contained, and I have no patience for a man who would try either of those things." "I am aware of all of that," he said, with a quiet warmth. "And I love you," she said, "and I would very much like to know if you intend to do something about that." The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. He reached into his coat pocket and held out his hand, and lying across his palm was a ring. A simple gold band set with a small piece of turquoise that was the same color as the Kansas sky on a clear day. "I bought that in November," he said, "from the trading post on the South Road. I have been carrying it ever since, trying to find the right time, which kept not being right." She looked at the ring, and then at him, and she felt the whole architecture of her life, the loss and the work and the fear and the fighting and the months of slow and careful and entirely unexpected love settle into something she could build on. "Ralph Yates," she said. "Ask me properly." He got down on one knee on the porch of the house she had fought for and held the ring out to her and said, "Eliza Merritt, you are the bravest and sharpest and most particular woman I have ever met, and I have loved you since before I had the right to, and I would like to spend the rest of my life being useful to you and being honest with you and trying to be worthy of you. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "I will." He put the ring on her finger and stood up, and she kissed him again, more slowly this time, with the spring evening warm and golden around them, and the prairie going quietly dark to the west. They were married in June of 1883 at the Caldwell Methodist Church, by a minister named Reverend Cole, who was a small bird-like man with a large voice and genuine warmth for weddings, which he considered the finest of his professional occasions. It was not a large wedding. Eliza had no family close enough to make the journey from Ohio in the time they had planned, though her sister sent a letter that arrived 2 days before the ceremony, and which Eliza read at the kitchen table, and then folded and pressed between the pages of the Bible Thomas had given her, because it contained things she wanted to keep. Ralph had a friend named Cooper from his time after the gang, a tall, quiet Texan who rode up from Wichita and stood as his witness without comment or ceremony. Mrs. Calvert came and cried. Avery Foss, the courthouse clerk, came and stood in the back row looking as if he was not sure he should be there, but had felt compelled by some dim sense of narrative justice. Patrick Hale, the water lawyer, sent his regards and a bottle of Kentucky bourbon from Dodge City. The deputy, Sands, did not come. Gerald Crane did not send his regards. Eliza wore a blue dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from a merchant in Wichita, because she was not going to be married again in gray wool. The blue was the same color as the turquoise in her ring, which had not been planned but which pleased her when she noticed it. She carried a small bunch of the prairie flowers that grew along the creek, white and yellow, that she had gathered herself that morning. She stood at the altar across from Ralph Yates, and she said the words, "I do," with the same clarity and the same conviction with which she had stood in courtrooms and filed deeds, and kissed a man she had once sworn to despise on the bank of a restored creek, which was to say completely and without reservation. He said the same words with the gravity of a man who understood what they meant and what he was promising, and Reverend Cole pronounced them married, and Ralph kissed her in the Methodist Church in Caldwell, Kansas in the summer of 1883, and Mrs. Calvert cried louder than before, and Cooper the Texan looked at the ceiling with great interest. They rode home to the homestead in the evening, Eliza on her own mare and Ralph on his bay, and the prairie was gold and soft in the late summer light, and the creek was running full, and the house had a new porch on the east side where the evening light came in, because Ralph had built it in May as a wedding gift, working 3 Saturdays in a row while she pretended not to notice what he was doing. "You knew about the porch," he said when she walked straight to it. "From the second Saturday," she confirmed. "And you said nothing." "I wanted to see how it turned out," she said. She stood on it looking out at the evening prairie. "It turned out beautifully." He came and stood beside her, and she leaned against him, and they watched the sun go down over their land, her land, their land, the land that had been fought for and held and was now going to be built on. And it was the kind of quiet that is not empty but full, the kind that comes when a person has arrived somewhere they are meant to be. The summer was busy and good. Ralph had a natural aptitude for cattle work that Eliza had half expected, and which he applied with the methodical patience she had come to know as his particular gift. They expanded the south pasture, as she had said she intended to. They planted a full kitchen garden that produced so abundantly that she put up 32 jars of preserves, and still had tomatoes to give to Mrs. Calvert. They argued twice about practical matters, once about whether to put money toward cattle or toward a new water pump, once about the fence line on the east side of the property, and both arguments were resolved through the application of direct conversation and mutual stubbornness in equal measure, which seemed to them both a fair outcome. Ralph's pass stayed where he had put it. No men came from the territories. The 2 resolved warrants remained resolved. Caldwell's opinion shifted slowly and then fairly thoroughly. A man who showed up for his wife's battles and fixed her fences and ran clean cattle and paid his accounts at the hardware store was, over time, just a man in the community, and the community had enough other concerns to stop focusing on who he had been 10 years ago. Gerald Crane lost 2 significant legal disputes in 1883. The water injunction had been only the first, and the gossip was that his creditors in Kansas City were becoming impatient. By November, he had sold off the east pasture lands and scaled back considerably. He was still a man of means and still not a man Eliza would willingly sit down to supper with, but he was no longer a man actively seeking to ruin her, and that was sufficient. In the late fall of 1883, Eliza realized she was pregnant. She stood in the kitchen on a November morning with this knowledge, the same kitchen she had stood in on so many hard mornings in the past year and a half, and she felt an emotion so large and complicated that she could not have named it precisely. Joy, yes, and something cautious underneath the joy, and something terrifyingly hopeful at the center of all of it. She told Ralph that evening. He was sitting at the table going over his tallies for the cattle count, and she put down 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him and said, without preamble, "I am going to have a baby." He went very still. Then he looked up at her. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I am certain," she said. He stood up from the table and came around to her and took her face in his hands with a gentleness that was so absolute it made her throat tight, and he looked at her for a long moment, searching, checking, making sure she was all right, and then he said very quietly, "Eliza." "Yes," she said. "Are you frightened?" "Terrified," she said honestly, and completely overjoyed. He pressed his forehead to hers, and they stood like that in the kitchen in the November dark, with the coffee going cold and the Kansas wind moving outside and the whole future opening up before them like a plain. The winter passed in the warmth that expectation gives to ordinary things. The cold mornings were sweeter, the evenings longer and more precious, the small rituals of their life together more vivid and real. Ralph was as attentive as a man could be without being smothering, which was the exact balance Eliza required, and which he had, by this point, a thorough understanding of. He made sure she was not doing anything that strained her unduly and learned quickly that pointing this out directly would result in a cool look and a demonstration that she was entirely capable of the task in question. So he redirected his concern into doing things himself without comment, which she noticed and appreciated without saying so, until the evening she said simply, "Thank you for being reasonable about this." And he understood exactly what she meant. The baby came in July of 1884, in the middle of a Kansas summer that was doing its very best impression of the surface of the sun. The midwife, a no-nonsense German woman named Mrs. Brower, who had delivered half the babies in Sumner County, arrived in the morning and stayed through the afternoon, and Ralph spent those hours on the east porch in the state of suppressed terror that is particular to husbands outside a birthing room, sitting very still with his hands laced together and doing an unconvincing impression of a calm person. The baby was a boy. He was healthy and loud, and had a head full of dark hair and a strong opinion about the world that he expressed at considerable volume from the first moments, which Mrs. Brower said was an excellent sign and which Ralph said sounded just like his mother, and Eliza, exhausted and bright-eyed, looked at them both and said that she hoped he would be so lucky. They named him James Thomas Yates, James for Ralph's father, Thomas for the man who had deserved to be here and was not. Eliza had thought it might be painful to use Thomas's name, to hand it to this new life, and in some ways it was painful, the quiet kind that is woven into love, but mostly it felt right. It felt like what Thomas himself would have wanted, to be remembered not only in grief but in forward motion, in new life, in the continuation of the things he had cared about. She thought he would have liked Ralph if they had met on better terms. She thought he might have seen in Ralph the same things she had come to see, the honesty underneath the history, the steadiness underneath the surface, the man who had been going in one direction and had turned himself around. James Thomas Yates was, from the first weeks of his life, a person of definite character. He was curious and persistent and unimpressed by obstacles, which Eliza recognized as entirely familiar, and he had Ralph's dark eyes and Eliza's stubborn chin, and a general attitude toward the world that was bright and open and interested in everything. He sat up early and crawled early and walked at 10 months, which neither of them had anticipated, and from that point forward required a level of vigilance that reorganized their days completely. The homestead grew with him. The south pasture expanded again in 1885, when they brought in 20 head of cattle from a reputable seller in Abilene. The kitchen garden produced reliably every summer. The house gained a second room in the spring of 1885, built by Ralph with help from a carpenter named Delray who rode out from Caldwell, and who became, over the course of the project, something like a friend. Caldwell itself was changing. The cattle trade was slowing as the railheads moved and fences changed the open range, and the town was beginning to consider what it wanted to be when the trail driving era was over. There was talk of farming, of irrigation, of the railroad spur that might or might not come through. The Yates homestead, with its clean cattle and productive land and water rights that were well established and legally secure, was increasingly a model rather than an exception. Ralph was invited to join the Sumner County Cattlemen's Association in 1885. He attended his first meeting with the particular expression of a man who is not sure he belongs in the room and has decided to behave as if he does. He came home and reported to Eliza that it had been largely unremarkable, that 3 men had shaken his hand, that 1 man had looked at him as if he were something unpleasant, and that there was a proposal on the table for a collective water rights petition that he thought was worth supporting. "You should go back," Eliza said. "I intend to," he said. "I just want you to know I have not lost my mind." "Attending a cattlemen's association meeting is not losing your mind," she said. "It is simply the predictable consequence of being a man who runs cattle." "When you put it that way," he said, and she could hear the dry amusement in it. She attended the Caldwell Ladies' Aid Society, which she had been quietly participating in since before the wedding, and which she now attended with the easy confidence of a woman who had no patience for nonsense, but a good deal of patience for the actual work of the community. She organized a school book drive in the winter of 1885 that collected more books than anyone had anticipated, and which the school used for 2 years before outgrowing them. She was not a woman who sought prominence, but she was a woman whose competence was difficult to overlook, and by 1886 she was the secretary of the society, which meant she kept the records and ran the meetings and made sure the actual work got done rather than just being talked about. Their second child came in the spring of 1886, a girl this time, with Eliza's dark hair and Ralph's steady eyes, born into a Kansas April that was soft and green and smelled of fresh earth after the first warm rain. They named her Clara Ruth Yates Clara because Eliza had always loved the name and had been saving it, Ruth for Ralph's mother, who had been a school teacher and whom he had not spoken to in many years, but whose name he had offered with a quiet seriousness that told Eliza it mattered. "Have you written to her?" Eliza asked, the night after Clara was born. She was in bed, the baby sleeping in the cradle Ralph had made through the fall, and Ralph was sitting beside her in the chair he had pulled close. "Not since I was 20, he said. "She doesn't know about any of this," Eliza said. "The land, the cattle, the marriage, James, Clara." "No," he said, "you should write to her." He was quiet for a while. "I don't know if she would want to hear from me." "She is your mother," Eliza said simply, "and you are a different man than the one she lost. I think she deserves the chance to know that." He looked at Clara sleeping in her cradle, small and perfect and entirely new. Something moved across his face that Eliza recognized as the particular emotion of a person confronting something they have been avoiding for years. "I'll write to her," he said. He wrote the letter in March of 1886 and sent it to the last Missouri address he had for her. In June, a letter came back, written in a schoolteacher's hand that was firm and clear and shaking only very slightly at the edges, and which said, among other things, that she had never stopped believing he might come back to himself, that she would like very much to see the grandchildren, and that she would consider making the journey to Kansas if the invitation was genuine. It was genuine. Ruth Yates came to Caldwell in September of 1886, a small white-haired woman with dark eyes that were unmistakably her son's, and she stepped off the train and looked at Ralph and said, "Well, you grew up." And then she looked at Eliza, who was standing beside him with Clara on her hip and James pulling at her other hand, and she said, "You must be extraordinarily patient." "I am," Eliza agreed, and Ruth Yates laughed, and it was a good beginning. She stayed for 3 weeks, sleeping in the new room they had built, playing with James and Clara in the kitchen garden, sitting with Eliza in the evenings while Ralph was doing the final fall cattle checks. She and Eliza talked in the way that women talk when they recognize each other, directly, without performance, about real things, about what Ralph had been as a boy, which was useful information, about what it had meant to lose him to the territories and what it meant to get something of him back, about grief and stubbornness and the work of being a woman who knew her own mind in places that did not always accommodate that. On the second to last evening of her visit, Ruth sat on the east porch with Eliza while the children slept inside and Ralph was doing a last check on the cattle, and she said, "He is happy." "I hope so," Eliza said. He seems so. I know my son's face, Ruth said. He is happy. That is because of you. Eliza thought about the courthouse steps in the cold October dawn, about the door being held, about the months of careful and complicated and completely unanticipated love. We are happy together, she said. That is not only because of me. Ruth smiled. No, she said, but you are the reason he stayed in one place long enough for it to happen. When Ruth left in October, she promised to return in the spring, and she kept that promise, and she kept it the spring after that, and she became a regular presence in their lives. A grandmother to James and Clara, a correspondent to Eliza, and a quiet restoration to Ralph that was never fully spoken about but that showed in the way he carried himself. The year 1887 brought a hard winter and then a good spring, and also the news that Gerald Crane had sold the last of his holdings in Sumner County and moved to Colorado, apparently having come to the conclusion that this particular corner of Kansas had been less profitable than anticipated. Eliza heard this news from Mrs. Calvert on a Tuesday morning and received it with the equanimity of a woman who had been waiting for the other shoe to drop for 4 years and had finally heard it land. He's gone, she told Ralph that evening. Good, he said. Do you feel anything about it? He considered honestly. I feel like a thing that was costing energy has stopped, he said. I suppose that is relief. Yes, she said. That is exactly what it is. The ranch, because by now it was properly a ranch, with 28 head of cattle and 2 working horses, and a reputation in the county for clean water and honest dealing, continued to grow through the late 1880s. James was running around the property with a purpose and a stubbornness that delighted both his parents, and Clara was developing a philosophical outlook on the world that manifested mainly in careful observation and occasional unexpected pronouncements that were usually more correct than not. The county grew and changed around them. Barbed wire fences divided the open range that the cattle drives had once crossed freely, and the old Kishom Trail was becoming a memory rather than a road. The railroad brought new settlers and new money and new problems, and the town of Caldwell worked out, in the way that towns work out things, what kind of place it was going to be. The school expanded. A second church went up. The courthouse was repaired and a new clerk's window installed, which Avery Foss occupied with the same careful neutrality he had brought to the old one. Eliza and Ralph's life settled into the rhythm of working land and raising children, and being members of a community that had, over years, come to regard them as one of its reliable anchors. It was not a life without difficulty. The cattle market fluctuated, the weather was unpredictable, the children got sick and the fences broke and the creek ran low in dry summers, but it was a life of substance and of genuine happiness, the kind that is built rather than found, the kind that takes years. In the spring of 1889, Eliza found herself pregnant for the 3rd time, which she announced to Ralph on a Sunday morning while he was drinking his coffee at the kitchen table, using exactly the same words she had used the first time. He looked up from his coffee. "Are you certain?" "I am certain," she said, as she had before. He set down his coffee and came around the table and kissed her firmly and said, "Good." "Good," she agreed. James, who was 4.5 and already possessed of a personality that suggested he would have opinions about everything for the rest of his life, demanded to know what was happening. "We are going to have another baby," Eliza told him. He considered this. "I hope it is a brother," he said seriously. "You have no control over that," Eliza told him. "I know," he said, with the philosophical resignation of a very small person who had already learned certain fundamental limits of agency. "But I hope so anyway." It was, in fact, a brother born in October of 1889, in an October that was warm and golden in a way that felt almost deliberate. And he came into the world with a remarkable placidity that was entirely unlike either his brother or his sister, and which struck the midwife Mrs. Brower as the most sensible disposition she had seen in a baby in years. They named him William Cooper Yates William for no particular Thomas this time, simply because they liked it, and Cooper for Ralph's old friend from Wichita who had stood as his witness at the wedding, and who had become, over the years, a genuine friend to both of them. Cooper himself, upon receiving the letter informing him of his namesake, rode down from Wichita specifically to meet the baby, which he did with considerable seriousness, holding small William in his large hands and examining him as if checking a purchase. "He looks sensible," Cooper said. "He is, apparently," Ralph said. "Good. There's enough wildness in this family already." He handed William back to Eliza. "Present company excluded, of course," he added to Eliza. "Of course," she said, with a smile that suggested she did not feel excluded at all. The homestead in those years had grown into something that would have been difficult to imagine from the window of the rented room above the dry goods store, where a sleepless woman had looked out at the pre-dawn street and decided to fight. The house was larger, its rooms full of the organized chaos of a family with 3 children and 2 working adults, and a grandmother who visited seasonally. The land was productive and well-maintained, the cattle herd steady and healthy, the water rights secure. Ralph was a different man from the one who had leaned against courthouse walls and ridden away from things that needed confronting. Not entirely different. He was still quiet, still prone to directness over diplomacy, still occasionally carrying a weight from his past that surfaced in his face on certain nights. But he was at home in himself in a way he had not been, rooted in something that ran deeper than any single decision or any particular year. He was, Eliza thought in the moments when she let herself fully see him, the most honest person she had ever known, not always right, not always easy, but genuine down to the bone and generous in the ways that counted. She was different, too. The gray wool dress still hung in the back of the wardrobe because she had kept it, as a reminder of who she had been on that October morning, determined and afraid and entirely alone, and walking up those steps anyway. She did not wear it. She did not need to. The determination was part of her now, had always been part of her, and the fear had given way to something sturdier and more sustainable, something that was built from love and work and years. James turned 10 in the summer of 1894 and began riding out with Ralph to check the cattle lines, which he did with great seriousness and some genuine aptitude. Clara was 8 and had the same steady intelligence as her grandmother Ruth, who was still writing letters from Missouri and making the journey to Kansas every spring, and who read Clara stories from the books that arrived in the school book drives that Eliza now organized annually. William was 4 and principally interested in the horses. On the morning of their 11th wedding anniversary, in June of 1894, Ralph woke early and had coffee ready when Eliza came downstairs, and he had set a small bunch of the white and yellow prairie flowers from the creek bank on the table in the same way she had carried them at their wedding. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the flowers and then at him. "You remembered," she said. "I remember everything about that day," he said, "including being terrified." "You did not look terrified." "I was exceptionally well composed," he agreed. She sat down across from him and took the coffee he pushed toward her and picked up one of the small yellow flowers and turned it in her fingers. Outside, the June morning was clear and warm, and the prairie was green, and the creek was running strong, and the children were still asleep, and the land stretched away in every direction as far as she could see. 11 years, she said. 11 years, he echoed. "Do you know what I thought that first morning?" she said. "On the courthouse steps. Tell me." "I thought you were the last person I wanted to see," she said. "I thought you were standing there to cause trouble. I thought I would have to fight past you as well as past everything else." "And then I held the door," he said. "And then you held the door," she said. "And I could not decide if that was the most unexpected thing that had ever happened to me or if it was the most logical." He was watching her with those dark eyes that she had spent 11 years learning to read and never fully grown tired of, warm and real, and full of the particular attention he gave to things he cared about. "Which did you decide?" he asked. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the morning light with the coffee warm in her hands and the flowers on the table and the whole life they had built together surrounding them in every direction, visible and real and thoroughly, undeniably theirs. "Both," she said. "Entirely both." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the way he had in the December barn 11 years ago with the newborn calf and the lantern burning down. And she turned her hand over and held his back, and the morning came fully into the kitchen, golden and clear and beginning. The cattle needed checking, and the children would be awake soon, and there was a fence section on the north pasture that Ralph had been meaning to get to. And Eliza had 3 letters to write for the Ladies' Aid Society, and a preserves order to put together for Mrs. Calvert, and William would need his boots resoled, and James had a question about the east pasture drainage that needed an answer, and Clara had asked to start piano lessons, which would require a piano, which would require a conversation about the household budget, and the creek was running high from a good spring rain and would need watching if the weather turned again. All of it waiting, ordinary and full and real and theirs. Eliza Merritt Yates, widow turned fighter turned wife turned rancher turned anchor of a family and a community, took the last swallow of her coffee and looked at the man across from her and said what she always said in some form on ordinary mornings and extraordinary ones, with 11 years of evidence to back it. "I love you, Ralph Yates." And he said, as he always did, with the plain, absolute honesty that had been his finest quality since a cold October dawn when he had held a courthouse door open for a woman he had no right to love and had loved anyway. "I love you, Eliza." The prairie moved outside. The creek ran. The children stirred upstairs. The horses moved in the morning light of the pasture. The land was green and held in theirs. And the day, like all the good days before it, and all the good days still to come, opened wide and full and forward.